The sun bled red over Ravenna on the evening of September 4th, 476 AD. Not the triumphant crimson of a conquering army's banners, but the pale, exhausted red of something ancient and wounded finally closing its eyes. The air tasted of smoke and marsh water, the particular flavor of an empire breathing its last. Somewhere beyond the city walls, torches moved in slow procession through the darkness, like the dying embers of a fire that had once lit the entire known world. On one side, a boy, 16 years old, a name too large for him, Romulus Augustulus, named after both the founder of Rome and its first emperor, as if history itself was mocking the distance between what Rome had been and what it had become. He sat on a throne built for gods and generals, his hands trembling around a scepter he had never truly held. On the other side, Odoacer, Germanic chieftain, 40 years old, patient as stone. His army, 25,000 Herulian, Syrian, and Rugian warriors, surrounded the city, not with rage, but with inevitability. The way a river surrounds an island it has already decided to swallow. This was not a battle, it was a reckoning. And when it ended, the world that had existed for 1,000 years simply stopped. To understand what died on that September evening, you must first understand what had lived. At its peak under Emperor Trajan in 117 AD, the Roman Empire stretched 5 million square kilometers from the cold moors of northern Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the banks of the Euphrates River in modern Iraq. 70 million people lived under Roman law. That was 1/3 of every human being alive on Earth. They shared roads, aqueducts, legal codes, and a single currency. Roman engineers built concrete structures that still stand today. Roman generals had never lost a war they truly needed to win. And then Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD. Not with a sword in his chest, not on a battlefield. He died quietly, as good men often do, and left behind him a world that had forgotten how to produce another man like him. His son Commodus took the throne vain, cruel, and catastrophically incompetent, and the slow unraveling began. But here is what makes Rome's fall so devastating, and so deeply human. It did not collapse because of one catastrophic moment. It rotted, slowly, over 300 years, the way a great oak tree dies still standing, still looking powerful from a distance, while inside, something hollow and dark is spreading outward from the core. By the 3rd century, Rome was consuming its own emperors. 26 men claimed the imperial throne between 235 and 284 AD. Most died violently. Civil wars erupted and extinguished themselves only to erupt again. The army, once the iron backbone of civilization, became a political instrument, selling its loyalty to whoever paid most or promised most. Legions that had once marched in perfect formation across conquered territory now marched against each other across Roman soil. The economy buckled under the weight of endless military spending. Taxes crushed the poor while the wealthy retreated behind the walls of their private estates. Trade shrank. Roads crumbled. Cities that had once been vibrant centers of commerce and culture hollowed out, their forums growing quiet, their market stalls going dark. And then, from the east, came something Rome had never truly faced before. The Huns, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppe. They rode horses with the terrifying precision of men born in the saddle, and they carried with them a particular genius for violence that sent shockwaves across the entire continent. In 376 AD, the Huns pushed into Gothic territory with such ferocity that massive populations of Goths, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children fled toward the Roman border in desperation. Rome made a decision it could not afford to make badly. It let them in. The Goths crossed the Danube and entered Roman territory. And Roman officials, corrupt and cruel, immediately began exploiting them, demanding bribes, stealing food, reportedly forcing starving Gothic families to sell their own children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. The Goths endured it. For a while. Then they rose. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, Gothic warriors killed the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens and destroyed an entire Roman army. It was the first major military defeat Rome had suffered on its own soil in centuries. The psychological damage was immense. The myth of Roman invincibility, which had been as much a weapon as any sword or siege engine, cracked for the first time. It would never fully heal. In 410 AD, The Visigoth king Alaric did what no foreign enemy had done in 800 years. He sacked Rome itself. The eternal city, the center of civilization, the seat of empire, the place where all roads led, was plundered for 3 days. Citizens who had been raised to believe Rome was protected by the gods stood in the streets and watched barbarian warriors carry their history away on their backs. The world did not end that day. But something essential went out of it. By 455 AD, the Vandals came and did it again. And after each sack, each humiliation, each emperor murdered or deposed, the western half of the empire grew smaller and quieter and more desperate. Between 455 and 476 AD, 9 different men claimed the title of Western Roman Emperor. None of them lasted more than 4 years. Most were controlled entirely by their military commanders, Germanic generals who used Roman titles the way a puppeteer uses strings. The last of those puppeteers was a man named Orestes. He was Roman by culture, Germanic by blood, and ruthlessly ambitious by nature. In 475 AD, he deposed the reigning emperor and placed his own teenage son on the throne, Romulus Augustulus, the boy with the impossible name. It was a move of breathtaking political recklessness, and it attracted the attention of exactly the wrong man. Odoacer had served in the Roman army. He knew how it worked. He knew what it was worth. And when Orestes refused to grant his Germanic troops the 1/3 of Italian land they had been promised for their service, Odoacer stepped forward not as a conqueror, but as a commander who had simply calculated that the time had come to stop pretending. He raised his forces, he marched, and the Western Roman Empire, which had ruled the known world for centuries, found itself defended by an exhausted ghost of an army and commanded by a child who had never chosen to be emperor in the first place. Ravenna was not Rome. That mattered. The imperial capital of the Western Empire had quietly relocated to this marshy city on the Adriatic coast in 402 AD, when the Emperor Honorius decided that Rome, magnificent, symbolic, beloved Rome, was actually quite difficult to defend. Ravenna, surrounded by wetlands and connected to the sea, was a fortress by geography. Its approaches were slow and treacherous. An enemy could not simply charge its walls, but Odoacer was not charging. He was surrounding. And there is a particular kind of psychological devastation in a siege that does not attack, it simply waits, patient and immovable, radiating the quiet certainty that it has already won. Odoacer's forces were a coalition that would have been unthinkable to Augustus or Trajan, Heruli, Syrians, Rugians, and other Germanic peoples, many of whom had served in Roman legions themselves. They knew Roman tactics. They understood Roman fortifications. They had been trained, in many cases, by Roman officers. They carried Roman-style shields alongside their own traditional weapons, the Francisca throwing axe, the skramus axe, long knife, the heavy thrusting spear. They numbered somewhere between 25 and 30,000 warriors, battle-hardened and unpaid, which made them dangerous in a very specific way. Men who are owed something fight with a focused, economical fury that is entirely different from patriotic rage. Opposing them, a Roman defensive force of perhaps a few thousand men, concentrated primarily in Ravenna and the surrounding garrison towns. Many were themselves Germanic mercenaries. The irony was suffocating. Rome's last defenders were indistinguishable in blood and culture from the men they were supposedly defending against. Orestes understood this. He had built his career on manipulating exactly these kinds of tensions, playing Roman identity against Germanic ambition with the calculated cynicism of a man who believed everything was negotiable. But he had miscalculated badly. When Odoacer's forces moved in late August of 476 AD, Orestes retreated to the fortified town of Piacenza, north of Ravenna, believing the walls would buy him time. They did not. Odoacer's men breached the defenses of Piacenza with a speed that suggested the garrison's heart was never truly in the fight. Orestes was captured not in battle, not with sword in hand, but reportedly attempting to find sanctuary in a local church. Odoacer did not honor the sanctuary. Orestes was executed on the spot, his body left for the crows, his ambitions ending in the mud of a northern Italian town that history would barely remember. With Orestes dead, the thread connecting Romulus Augustulus to any real military power was severed completely. The boy emperor had no army. He had no allies. He had, in a very practical sense, nothing except a title that now meant nothing to anyone except perhaps himself. In Ravenna, the night before Odoacer's arrival, was not the night of soldiers sharpening swords and commanders studying maps. There were no dramatic war councils, no midnight prayers around battlefield fires, no speeches about Roman glory delivered to ranks of determined men. That version of Rome was gone. What remained was quieter and more devastating. Somewhere in the imperial palace, a building of extraordinary beauty, its mosaics still gleaming with the blues and golds that Roman craftsmen had perfected over centuries, a 16-year-old boy sat alone with the weight of a name he had never asked to carry. History does not record what Romulus Augustulus thought that night. It does not record whether he wept or prayed or simply stared at the ceiling with the blank incomprehension of a person who has never been given the chance to understand the thing they are about to lose. We only know that he was there, and that by the next evening he would not be emperor. In the barracks, the men who remained the tired, underpaid remnant of what had once been the greatest military force in human history, did what soldiers have always done on the eve of an ending they cannot prevent. Some drank, some wrote names on scraps of leather. Some simply sat in the darkness and listened to the sound of the marsh, the frogs and the water, and the distant, steady beat of a different world pressing against the walls. Odoacer himself, if the accounts can be trusted, was not celebrating. He was organizing. A logistics problem to solve, a transition to manage, an empire's bureaucratic machinery to inherit and repurpose. He had spent his career inside Roman institutions. He respected their mechanisms even as he dismantled their leadership. He was not the barbarian of Roman nightmares. He was something Rome had never quite prepared a defense against. A pragmatist who saw clearly, moved efficiently, and felt no particular need to be cruel when efficiency would serve just as well. The morning of September 4th came cold and gray, the autumn mist lying thick across the marshes, muffling sound, softening the edges of everything, as if the world itself was trying to make what came next slightly less sharp. Phase 1. The weight of silence. The sound of an empire ending is not what you expect. There are no war drums in this story. No cavalry charges thundering across open plains, no war cries splitting the sky, no clash of 10,000 swords meeting 10,000 shields in the kind of glorious, terrible collision that fills the histories of other battles. The fall of the Western Roman Empire arrived on September 4th, 476 AD, not as a storm, but as a fog slow, total, and impossible to fight with any weapon ever forged. The mist off the Adriatic marshes smelled of salt and rot that morning. It clung to the walls of Ravenna, to the banners that still hung above the city gates, the eagle of Rome, tattered now, its gold faded to the color of old bone. The soldiers posted on the walls could see the fires of Odoacer's encampment through the murk, dozens of points of orange light stretching across the flat landscape in every direction. Not threatening, not charging, just present, immovable, patient. That patience was the weapon. It had been the weapon all along. Inside the city, people moved through the early morning hours with the particular numbness of those who have been waiting for something terrible for so long that when it finally comes, they almost feel relief. Merchants did not open their stalls. Priests knelt in basilicas and spoke prayers that had no particular addressee. Children, sensing the stillness in their parents, stayed close and quiet. The city breathed, but barely. Phase 2. Piacenza, the cutting of the thread. But the ending had actually begun several days earlier, 30 miles to the north. Orestes, the man who had put his son on the throne, the man who had effectively been the real emperor for nearly a year, the last genuine power behind the Roman name in the West, had made his final stand at Piacenza. Not a glorious stand. Not the kind that fills epic poems and inspires future generations. A desperate, cornered stand, the kind that history records only in footnotes. Odoacer's forces moved on Piacenza with the mechanical efficiency of men who have been told what to do and see no reason to waste energy on drama. The walls of the town were not formidable. The garrison defending them was not committed. When the assault came, it came quickly, and it ended quickly, and when it was over, the defenders either surrendered or died, and Orestes ran. He ran to a church. The detail matters. In a world where Roman law was unraveling and Germanic pragmatism was replacing it, Orestes reached for the oldest protection available, the sanctity of sacred space. He pressed himself against the stone walls of that church and claimed the shelter of God. Odoacer's men came in after him. There was no ceremony to what followed. No formal charges, no public execution, no speech acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Orestes was a problem that needed to be removed. And he was removed. His body was left in the church where he had sought sanctuary, a detail that Rome, in its better days, would have found deeply shocking. In 476 AD, nobody was particularly surprised. The thread snapped. Ravenna was next. Phase 3. The gates open. By September 4th, Odoacer had brought his full force to the walls of Ravenna. And here, history delivers its most quietly devastating detail. The gates opened, not because they were breached, not because the walls were scaled or the defenses overwhelmed. The gates of the last imperial capital of the Western Roman Empire opened because the men inside them had made a simple, terrible calculation. There was nothing left worth dying for. The garrison, many of them Germanic themselves, fighting for a Roman paycheck that had grown increasingly irregular, looked at the army outside the walls, looked at the boy emperor inside the palace, and opened the gates. Odoacer Rodin. He rode through streets that had once hosted triumphal processions, generals returning from Gaul, from Britain, from the edges of the known world, the crowds throwing flowers and screaming the names of men who had conquered nations. Now the streets were quiet. People stood in doorways and watched in silence as the German chieftain and his warriors moved through the heart of what had once been the capital of the world. Some bowed, some simply stared. A few wept, though history does not record whether those tears were for Rome or simply for themselves. But this was not a sack. Odoacer had not come to destroy. He had come to inherit. And that distinction that Rome did not burn but was simply transferred, like property changing hands after the death of its owner, is perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all. The buildings remained. The mosaics remained. The roads and aqueducts and law courts and tax records all remained. Only the thing that had given them meaning was gone. Phase 4. The boy and the crown. They brought Romulus Augustulus before Odoacer in the imperial audience chamber. The room was still magnificent. Columns of imported marble, floors tiled in geometric patterns of red and black, light filtering through high windows in long shafts that fell across the mosaic portraits of emperors who had actually mattered: Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, men who had bent the world to their will and left it different than they found it. The boy standing in that light was none of those things, and every person in the room understood that. History gives us almost no words for this moment. No final speech from Romulus Augustulus, no declaration of defiance, no prayer or curse or farewell to the civilization his family had just collapsed. He was 16 years old, and he had never wanted to be emperor, and now he was going to stop being emperor, and the most honest thing that can be said about that moment is simply, it happened. He removed the imperial diadem. The laurel wreath of gold that represented an unbroken line of authority stretching back, in one form or another, to Julius Caesar, to Augustus, to the Republic and the Senate, and the ancient compact between Rome and its people. He placed it in the hands of Odoacer. Odoacer held it for a moment, this small, heavy circle of gold, and then set it aside. He had no use for the symbolism of Rome's imperial tradition. He was not going to become emperor himself. He was going to be something new, King of Italy, a title that had never existed before, for a political reality that had never existed before. He was not interested in inheriting the myth. He had come for the practical machinery. The boy was escorted out. He was not executed. Odoacer showed him mercy, genuine mercy, or perhaps simply the mercy of a man who recognized that killing a 16-year-old would create a martyr and solve nothing. Romulus Augustulus was given a pension and sent to Castellum Lucullanum, a villa on the Bay of Naples that had once belonged to the general Lucullus. It was a comfortable exile, as exiles go. Views of the Mediterranean, good air, enough money to live quietly. He would outlive the empire whose name he bore by decades. The crown sat on a table in the imperial audience chamber. No one put it on. No trumpets announced the moment. No historian in the room wrote down the exact words spoken, if any words were spoken at all. The last scene of the Western Roman Empire played out in near silence, in a beautiful room, without drama. It was over. Phase 5. The insignia goes east. Within days, Odoacer made a gesture that was simultaneously practical, diplomatic, and devastating in its implications. He gathered the imperial regalia, the diadem, the purple cloak, the scepter, all the physical symbols of Western Roman imperial authority, packed them carefully, and sent them east. To Constantinople. To the Emperor Zeno, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, the surviving half, the half that had watched the West collapse with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided not to throw himself in front of a moving cart. The message Odoacer sent with the regalia was elegant in its efficiency. It stated, essentially, that one emperor was sufficient for the Roman world, and that one emperor was Zeno. The West no longer required its own. Odoacer would govern Italy as Zeno's representative, as a subordinate king under nominal Roman authority, maintaining the fiction of Roman continuity while the reality of Germanic rule settled into place beneath it. Zeno received the regalia, he read the message, and he agreed. There were no legions sent, no war declared, no speech of outrage from the throne of Constantinople about the death of Rome's western half. Zeno had, in truth, little interest in the West and insufficient resources to reconquer it. The Eastern Empire had its own problems, its own restless Germanic generals, its own economic pressures, its own theological controversies tearing at the social fabric of its cities. The West was a liability. The regalia was a symbol. Symbols could be acknowledged and then quietly set aside. And so the last act of the Western Roman Empire was not a battle, it was a package. A courier riding east through the autumn landscape of northern Italy, carrying a box of gold and purple fabric, delivering to the surviving half of a civilization the formal notification that its other half no longer existed. The courier rode east. Behind him, the roads of the Western Empire stretched in every direction, still straight, still paved, still engineering marvels, connecting cities that were already beginning to forget what they had once been connected for. The sun set over Italy. The mist came back off the marshes, and in the palace at Ravenna, Odoacer sat down to work. What followed was not apocalypse. It was something quieter and, in many ways, stranger. The city of Ravenna did not burn. The citizens of Rome did not riot. The bureaucrats who had served the empire continued reporting to their offices, because bureaucrats understand, perhaps better than anyone, that the machinery of civilization does not stop simply because the name above the door changes. Tax collectors still collected taxes. Judges still administered law, Roman law, because there was no other law anyone knew how to use. The roads were still there. The aqueducts still ran. But the numbers told a different story. In the aftermath of 476 AD, historians estimate that the population of the city of Rome itself had already collapsed from a peak of perhaps 1 million people to somewhere between 50 and 100,000, a reduction of 90% within a few generations. The city that had once required 11 aqueducts to satisfy its thirst now needed one. The forums where senators had debated the fate of nations grew grass between their flagstones. The great insulae apartment buildings, once crowded 7 stories high, with the noisy life of a world city, stood half empty, their upper floors abandoned to wind and birds. Romulus Augustulus lived out his days at Castellum Lucullanum, overlooking the Bay of Naples. History loses track of him after a point. A final letter from Odoacer to him survives, increasing his pension, which suggests he was alive at least until the 490s. He outlasted Odoacer himself, who was murdered in 493 AD by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, during a dinner stabbed personally, the sources say, by Theodoric's own hand. The man who ended the Western Roman Empire was himself ended at a dinner table, which is perhaps history's way of maintaining a certain dark consistency. Orestes lay in the church at Piacenza. The Germanic kingdoms began their division of the western territories with the methodical efficiency of new owners walking through a property. The Ostrogoths settled Italy. The Visigoths consolidated Spain. The Franks extended their reach through Gaul. The Anglo-Saxons accelerated their conquest of Roman Britain, which had already been abandoned by the imperial military decades earlier. Where one empire had imposed a unified system of law and culture and commerce, a dozen different kingdoms now pursued a dozen different visions of what the post-Roman world should be. Long-distance trade collapsed. Not immediately, not completely, but steadily. The intricate web of commerce that had moved grain from North Africa to Rome, wine from Gaul to Britain, glass from Syria to everywhere, began to unravel as political instability made the roads dangerous and the currencies unreliable. Literacy rates dropped. The production of written documents, legal records, administrative correspondence, literary works declined sharply across the former Western territories. The physical darkness that fell over parts of Europe in this period was in some places quite literal. Archaeological evidence shows that the atmospheric pollution caused by Roman industrial activity, the smelting of lead, the burning of wood for construction and heating on an imperial scale declined significantly in the centuries after 476, because the population that had driven that activity had contracted so dramatically. The Eastern Empire, from Constantinople, observed all of this and survived. For now, centuries later, a Frankish king named Charlemagne would stand in a cathedral in Rome on Christmas Day, 800 AD, and receive a crown from the Pope that he had not asked for the title of Roman Emperor, restored after more than 300 years of absence. He would spend the rest of his reign trying to live up to the name. He could not. No one ever would again. But the attempt tells you everything about what Rome meant, and continues to mean. The civilization that Odoacer quietly dismantled in 476 AD refused to stay dead in the imagination of the Western world. Every major European power for the next 1,000 years would define itself in relation to Rome either as its successor, its inheritor, or its revival. The Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Catholic Church, which adopted Roman administrative structures so thoroughly that its organizational map still echoes the provincial system of the ancient empire. The legal codes of France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Romania built on Roman foundations so deep that the architects of modern democracy often did not realize they were borrowing from Augustus. The Latin language did not die. It became French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. It became the language of science and medicine and law for 1,500 years after Rome fell. It lives in every English word with a Latinate root and in English, that is, most of the important ones. Justice, republic, constitution, senate, civilization itself, the roads are still there. Drive through the English countryside, through rural France, through the landscapes of North Africa or the Middle East, and you will still find Roman roads, straight lines cutting through terrain that has forgotten everything else about the empire that built them. They were constructed to last, and they have. Long after the legions that marched on them turned to dust, long after the emperors who ordered them built were reduced to names in textbooks, the roads remain. Practical, determined, pointing toward a horizon that the men who built them believed they would always control. What killed Rome? 1,000 historians have offered 1,000 answers. Military overextension, economic collapse, political instability, the rise of Christianity, the migration of peoples, climate change, lead poisoning from the pipes. The truth is probably all of these things, working together across 3 centuries in the way that great structures fail not from a single blow, but from the slow accumulation of stresses that individually might be managed and together cannot be survived. But there is another answer, simpler and more uncomfortable. Rome died because it forgot what it was. The Roman identity, civic, legal, universal, aspirational, that had once assimilated Gauls and Greeks and North Africans and Syrians into a single civilization, stopped being a living thing and became a performance. When the actual people living inside Roman institutions no longer believed in them, no walls were thick enough and no army large enough to compensate. The sun went down over Ravenna on September 4th, 476 AD. A boy walked out of a palace with no crown. A German chieftain sat down at a Roman desk, and the world that had existed for 1,000 years filed quietly away into history. But here is what endures. Every time you stand before a court of law and expect justice. Every time a government is held accountable to written rules rather than the whims of whoever holds the sword. Every time a road takes you somewhere straight and true, cutting through landscape that would otherwise have no path, Rome is still there. Diminished, transformed, unrecognizable perhaps, but present, still speaking, still pointing towards something it believed in enough to build into stone. Centuries later, the marshes around Ravenna are quiet. The palace mosaics still shine. The eagle, tattered and faded, is everywhere if you know how to look for it. It never entirely landed. It never entirely fell.